Hello, you've tuned to this week's episode of Next Steps Forward, and I'm your host, Chris Meek. As always, it's an honor to have you with us. Next Steps Forward is committed to helping others achieve more than ever while experiencing greater personal empowerment and well-being. This year is the 25th observance of the September 11 terrorist attacks. I encourage you to visit the 9/11 Legacy Foundation website at the 911legacy.org. That's the 911legacy.org to learn more. To raise awareness about that important date in America's history, I've been hosting a number of guests who lived through the attacks and or have been motivated by the memories of that day and its aftermath to act in the service of others. My very special guest today is Professor Jeremy Stoddard, Professor of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and a researcher with the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. And he's one of the nation's leading scholars on how America teaches 9/11 to the next generation. He and his colleague, Diana Hess, have written extensively about how teaching 9/11 is changing with the times, and they've proposed different approaches to teaching about the events of that tragic day. Professor Stoddard has also co-authored or co-edited 3 books, including Teaching Difficult History Through Film. Professor Jeremy Stoddard, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
It's my pleasure to be here, Chris.
No, it's great to be here. Great to have you here. I really appreciate your time. You're wrapping up the semester, so I know you're trying to get a little summer vacation out there, so grateful for it. So a little bit about you before we dive into the topic of teaching 9/11 history to middle school and high school students. First, what drew you to education and the study of history and civic life? Do you come from a family of academics?
Yeah, no, I actually grew up in a very rural area in southern Minnesota, but I was one of those kids who would make everyone stop whenever we passed a historical marker. Whenever we did travel, it would any historical site I would sort of be begging to go to. I think I was always very interested in both sort of gobbling up whatever history I could learn. And I think part of my interest in film and television is much of the way, especially when I was younger, I experienced the world was through that, being exposed to different things, because otherwise it was, southern Minnesota is pretty much cornfields and hogs. There's not a whole lot out there. But also I was always very curious as to how people experienced history, I think, and how people learned about it and engaged with it in different spaces, including, at historical sites through various media. And so that drove me both to be interested in history, but also then, a couple of things when I was in high school and then university sparked me to want to become a teacher. And so then I went and taught middle school in Minneapolis and St. Cloud, Minnesota. And then I got really interested again, and this was sort of the early days of the internet and classrooms and things in educational technology. And so that led me eventually down the road to graduate school and then more into academia.
So I loved how you started that response by saying how you used to be the person or the kid that would make people stop and look at the memorials as you drove by them. One of the things my team has been talking about recently is, people drive by memorials and monuments all the time, but they have no idea what they mean or what they represent. Yeah. And so for you at a very young age to actually realize and recognize that, we need more of that and brought forward to the classroom. And so I appreciate you sharing that. What fascinates you most about the relationship between history, democracy, and education?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we talk a lot about in our world, and I frame a lot of my work around, is democratic education. So sort of going beyond a certain subject area to more so the bigger question of how do we help young people engage with each other to talk about how we want to live together, essentially, right? How to live together in a democracy. And one of the original goals of comprehensive schooling for everyone was engaging people as informed citizens. And this means it's not just a specific sort of subject area like history or government or civics courses, but also just how do we engage with each other within classes, within schools? How do we sort of share governance, like all these types of aspects that are important for transferring outside of school. And I think today it's even more important because schools for many students may be the one place where they really engage across difference. They're not necessarily living near people who are different from them, different religion, different languages, different different sort of values in different ways. And so in political values, especially. And so schools might be the place where they actually do learn to engage across difference, try to understand why people believe what they believe, and be able to sort of negotiate those spaces, which is things that, we want people to be able to do in the world outside of school. And I don't know that they see the best models right now outside of school. And so I think school is one place where we can at least try to do that.
We need more teachers with that mindset because, to your point, outside the school, we're not seeing that courteous civic engagement, I'll call it.
Yeah.
Jeremy, where were you on September 11th, 2001? And what do you remember most vividly about that day, both emotionally and intellectually?
Yeah, so I was working. I'd actually just finished my master's degree, or was finishing it here at UW-Madison in their educational communications and technologies program, and I was working for a regional agency in Wisconsin here on basically doing professional development around educational technology. And one of the projects we had was a school where we had an elementary classroom wired up with cameras as a demonstration classroom for professional development to show how you could use technology in the school. And so I was the person that sort of ran the recordings and made videos and prepared professional development. And so that morning, I first heard of the first plane crash, actually, as I was driving out to the school. And by the time I had arrived, and a colleague of mine was there, and her brother actually flew for American out of Boston. So it was actually a good hour or so that it was very sort of tense as she was trying to get in touch with her brother and see if he was flying that day. It was one of the routes of one of the planes that went down. And so once she found out that he wasn't flying that day, it obviously lessened the load quite a bit. But we were sort of glued to the news and as it was unfolding. And I actually spent part of the day, so in this room that we had set up with recording, we were sort of following online. And then I actually went and spent some of it in the high school library with high school students. And so it was curious for them in Wisconsin to be, raising questions, watching what was coming on the news. There's actually a part of the naval station up in northern Wisconsin that went into lockdown because it runs all the communications for submarines around the world. And so it was interesting to see even in our area how things were being considered because no one really knew what was going on. There was so much sort of chaos that day, and what was happening. So I think it was both sort of the chaos and questions that everyone had, and to me then it started to raise other questions about what were the things that came before it, what were some of the things that we knew, didn't know. And pretty quickly, because I'd also been a teacher when like Columbine hit and some of these other events, I think pretty quickly we were starting to think about how do you respond to this in classrooms? How do you help young people sort of figure it out? And because I'd also started to work with sort of pre-service teachers, how do you help new teachers deal with it? Like what are the conversations that they could have or shouldn't have maybe? And what I remember also sort of intellectually that day is thinking about how can we respond to these types of events in classrooms, what's appropriate, what's ethically appropriate, what role do families play, what role should we play as teachers, and how do we sort of communicate and get on the same page with each other to figure that out so that they're also not spending 8 hours a day in every classroom talking about this topic too, right? It's a tricky decision. And so we had heard, classrooms in Madison, some of them were watching television live in class, in a middle school class. And, then all of a sudden they recognized that there were bodies falling and so kids, that was very sort of traumatizing for kids. And in other cases, teachers didn't want to talk about it at all and principals were telling them that. So I think for me, it was starting to think about how do we react in these situations and help students work through sort of the emotions that they were feeling in this uncertainty. And that came, even more clear when I later on taught in Virginia. And we had a lot of students from Northern Virginia who were in my classes at William and Mary, and they would talk about how their memories of that day were, they were in kindergarten or first grade or second grade, and their parents being afraid and picking them up in Northern Virginia, and sort of the different type of fear and things that they experienced that were so much closer than what we had experienced, say, in Wisconsin. So, I think it stuck with me when we've had other events that are, not quite the same in terms of a collective memory event. But things like the January 6th, things where we saw things unfolding on television that were obviously a major sort of crisis unfolding, and then how do we deal with that in the classroom? So that's always sort of been riding in the back of my mind, and something that we try to prepare teachers for.
You talked about how back then, 25 years ago, when things first happened, or even a year later, teachers were afraid to teach it because of the trauma, either for the children or for themselves or for both. I've been talking to educators. I've been talking to book publishers, for the last couple of years, and they're all saying the same thing, that they don't want to publish a book about 9/11 because they don't want to dig up past trauma and experiences. They don't want to teach it because it may traumatize the teacher. Maybe there's some experience with them, or they're afraid that will, to your point, traumatize the kids if they watch the videos with the jumpers. How do we, or can we even get past that?
Yeah, I think one of the things I heard a lot when I was in Virginia, and this is, Williamsburg, Virginia is right at the epicenter of a lot of the East Coast military sort of establishments. We have the, Norfolk, the giant naval base, the SEALs train there, Army, Air Force, like all sort of right there. So my neighborhood had lots of folks who were active duty, including being deployed abroad. And a lot of the teachers in the high schools there expressed anxiety over teaching about the war on terror and 9/11 because they were worried that they had kids whose parents were deployed and could potentially be wounded or killed. And when I talked to my neighbors about that, it would really generally consistently upset them, regardless of sort of their political views, their background, what rank they were at, because they said, they want people talking about why they're over there. They want people to understand. And one of the things I started to recognize was people had no idea even where U.S. service members were deployed across the world, that they didn't understand the risks that they were taking. And this was a big, I think, shift from the, say, Vietnam era because it was all, essentially a volunteer army, and it drew from definitely some regions more than others and some classes more than others, that there was less connection, I think, to the military than there had been in previous conflicts. And people, went on with their daily life after a while, maybe not understanding exactly what was going on. So to me, then that made a stronger case for teaching about it, and teaching about it in a way that allowed space for students who did have, parents who were deployed or relatives who were deployed, or had experienced it in more closely in terms of if they were in Northern Virginia on 9/11 or near New York, that they had space to work through those questions and emotions too. So I think today the big challenge to me is that from what we've seen, for teachers who were alive and have memories of 9/11, along with most folks at that time, because we all experienced it either for folks in New York like you in person or largely live on television, we have a very searing sort of collective memory of it. And we want to share that to some degree. So a lot of teachers feel the need as an important event that they want to share it, but because it doesn't really fit in their curriculum well, or because they're not sure exactly how to approach it maybe. They're often doing it as a sort of this day in history. Here's how I experienced it. Here's some of the video of the day. Which, if I was a student, it would be sort of horrifying to see this. And then they sort of go on with their next lesson, the beginning of the revolution or the early colonial period, if you're in U.S. history, or whatever it might be in the fall because of where it's timed. And it leaves then a lot of questions, I think, for young people who then have to go and explore it on their own. And that's where we run into issues in terms of conspiracy theories or finding maybe stereotypical things. One of the things I bring up constantly with teachers is, up until 9/11, the number one terrorist threat in the US were like white nationalist groups. And those almost completely drop out of the standards and out of the textbooks after 9/11. It becomes solely focused largely on, Islamic fundamentalist terrorist groups and examples. So I think like Oklahoma is one of the few states that maintained it because of the federal bombing of the building in Oklahoma City. Otherwise, a lot of other states, it really shifted the narrative of what terrorism is and who terrorists are. And that sort of changed sort of how I think we view parts of the world. And it also changed a little bit how we talk about some of those things, domestically. And the domestic part really drops out. And, today now with some of the, political violence and things that we're seeing, I think people maybe have a harder time trying to figure out what does terrorism actually mean? Are there certain criteria? How should we think about it? What does it mean for people to become radicalized in different ways by different groups? And how can we do some of these things when it's family members or people we know to sort of combat some of this extremism that we're seeing, especially with, now social media and online, things that we didn't necessarily have at 9/11 that came sort of soon after in many ways.
You've warned about the dangers of what you call a simple narrative when it comes to teaching subjects like 9/11. What are those dangers, and especially related to 9/11, and what's the safeguard against them?
Yeah, I think the One of the things that when it came to the 20th anniversary, I was trying to think through, like, now it's 20 years later. We had done a survey at the time when basically seniors would have been the last group. Seniors in high school would have been the last group that would have been alive when 9/11 happened. And we're trying to figure out, well, what are teachers teaching now that basically all students don't have a memory of it? And that's when we found out still it was a lot of the sort of teaching on the anniversary, and then maybe a little bit in world history around teaching the Middle East, and maybe a few other places in a government curriculum. But for the most part, if it was taught, it was at the very end of the year and sort of rushed. And so what they ended up largely getting was the sort of simple narrative of the US was attacked, by this group. It sort of looks like it came out of nowhere, oftentimes as it's portrayed. And so we thought about what are ways that we can engage students in it that would fit in the curriculum. It could be used at the beginning of the year. And one of the things that sort of I was trying to make the case of in the 20th anniversary is all of our social studies classes, for the most part in the US, have been trying to shift to a more of an inquiry format, using primary sources to teach students skills that are sort of both great for academic history, but also transfer to other things, including like media literacy. And so I went back and actually watched the full coverage of NBC of that day, the sort of live feed coming out of there. And what you started to notice is one of the early stories that was being covered was a drone that was shot down over Iraq that morning. And started to say, well, why was there a drone? Why was the US over Iraq at that time? Later on, you notice how quickly Osama bin Laden's picture and name and identity and location are come up. It's within like 45 minutes of, I think, the first attack, something like that. And how does that fit with this narrative of it sort of came from nowhere? They have an expert on talking about their location, talking about the previous bombings on the Trade Center, right? And so using that as a starting place for asking questions of students and then trying to go find evidence of it. What was the history of US in the region? What did they know about in advance of this? And it starts to then, I think, both complicate that history, but also start to make it less of an enigma of that sort of day, and start to understand that this is part of a larger trajectory, a larger history of basically a century of European and US involvement in this region, and not in a causal necessarily way, but you start to understand where this is coming from. And the other way to go from that direction, there's the other example I use, there's a West Wing episode, which they delayed the start of their season. And they did a special episode that they filmed very quickly. And it's of this school group that gets trapped in the White House during a tour because there's a terrorist threat or something like that. But even in that, they pretty quickly start to identify issues that they think are coming, which is, stereotyping and racial profiling of Muslim Americans, right? Some of these issues and surveillance and sort of, trampling on people's rights as a way to sort of do these things. They sort of foreshadow that in this episode, which came out, it was like a week later. And so starting to see then, well, why did they think that these would occur? Like Aaron Sorkin isn't a genius who just can see through the future, right? There were some reasons why they thought that. And so starting to use that to complicate the moment a little bit more, like what did we know then? Why did they think these things were going to happen? And look both historically how we can explain it, as well as to the future. And I don't think that you have to spend huge amounts of time to do that. And so one of the things that we argued is you can teach 9/11 either as part of developing media literacy skills at the beginning of the semester, or starting to develop these primary source sort of analysis skills and use that as a topic, and then link into events that later on in the year you'll sort of hit as you go along in US history. So it could be sort of a framing event that's also a skill development event at the beginning of the year. And we've seen teachers do all sorts of examples of these projects, including some that teach a modern history course around like 4 big events or 4 big moments, with like 9/11 being one of them. But it's a rarity for teachers to have the ability to sort of structure classes like that today, because of standardization, because of AP testing, because of these different things. There's a lot less flexibility in doing those types of elective courses. But I still think there's really powerful ways that you can use it even at the beginning of the year, if you don't have to follow even if you're following sort of a chronology, that it can be used to introduce and engage students in thoughtful ways to think about how it's relevant still today, as well as how it ties into the past.
You know, I'm going to comment on two things. You mentioned racial profiling that happened shortly after 9/11, and that reminded me, I was on a flight from LaGuardia to Chicago about a month afterwards, and didn't think about it, but there was a family in front of me, a Muslim family in traditional Muslim garb, husband, wife, and a son. There was probably, I'll say 6 or 7, and they were pulled out of the line to get on the plane. And the husband started to complain. He was making his case, and I didn't know at first what was happening. Then I realized what was happening. And so then the security immediately came and pulled me out to take me in the room and frisk me as well. And so that was a real thing. And unfortunately, it still is. And then the other thing is, you've mentioned a few times about how, teachers sort of cram it into one sort of a half lesson plan, maybe a day if you're lucky. I was talking to a colleague of mine about a month ago who lives in a Virginia suburb outside of Washington. He was deployed 3 times for the global war on terror. His son is now in middle school. And when he asked him what they teach about 9/11, he said, "Oh, well, Dad, it's a half-day lesson." And then the dad said, "Well, how about the global war on terror?" And the son said, "That's in the same lesson." So a 20-year war, 2,977 people murdered in broad daylight is a half-a-day lesson. Do you think part of the challenge, you've talked a little about the trauma, about teachers not wanting to do it either for themselves or for the students, but do you think part of the challenge maybe is just sort of where it falls in the academic calendar, sort of that first or second week back to school, and people are just getting started and they don't want to talk about something as dark as that?
Yeah, I think, and I think there's some legitimate things. If you're at the beginning of the school year, normally if we're going to engage in controversial issues or topics historically that take some level of comfort in the setting that you're working in, you want to build up that sort of classroom community to get your relationships with students, to build that trust between each other so they feel comfortable saying things and saying things that may be ignorant and supporting each other to work through it, right? That's all things that teachers want to do in their classes and need to do, I think, to be able to engage in these discussions. Again, I think, talking about events related to 9/11, you don't have to delve into all the film of the day. You can find different ways to approach it. And I think especially if you're in middle school or that, we know a lot of folks use some of the other stories around it to talk about aspects of the events without directly going into the details of the attacks themselves and some of the numbers lost and those kinds of things, that there are a lot of different ways to approach it. But it also seems like a good opportunity because of the timing to use it as a space to start to develop that relationship, to also learn or model how can we engage in these events that have impacted broadly the U.S. and that people still strongly have in their memories. Not the kids that are in school now, less and less the teachers, maybe even because they're not that old. But it's also a great way for them to connect with their parents, grandparents, older neighbors, and talk about the issues of memory versus history. I think one of the things that we have found with younger teachers now coming through, because they don't have the same collective memory, they view it as a really important aspect of history that impacts their lives and impacted them growing up. And so they want to very much engage with it that way, but they feel limited in the control that they have over their curriculum of what they can do. And so I think it's a different kind of challenge that we found for younger teachers than it is for folks who actually experience the events when they happen. And so I think there's different approaches that could work, but I think to some degree, it needs to be made a priority if that's what folks should want to do. And I think given the relevance to things today, it's such an important topic. If you're going to try to understand, the current war in Gaza, in Iran, the shipping, the role of oil, right? All of these things are tied together with a long history of the U.S. and Europe in that region. They, to some degree, tie back to 9/11. Issues like the surveillance package that just is up in front of the Congress again, right? Drones, like all these things, a lot of these things have such ties to the global war on terror, to 9/11, the TSA and Homeland Security. Homeland Security didn't exist before that, right? So even the militarization of police, there's all these things that came out in the years after 9/11 that were actually quite controversial in the U.S. That now are sort of normalized and people don't recognize where they came from. One of the things I tell teachers too is, back in the day, and now I sound old, but pre 9/11, you would never see military recruiters in most states you wouldn't see them out in a cafeteria. You wouldn't see them out broadly in schools. They would be in an office somewhere. They would have scheduled hours. Students could sign up and go and meet with them. But it was only after 9/11 and after, I think, the invasion of Iraq, when the recruitment targets were going low, that you saw them more and more actively out in schools in terms of recruiting. And the same with saying the pledge or the national anthem at the beginning of the school of the day. A lot of schools didn't do that before 9/11. And in some places, it was very controversial afterward. And so it raised, I think, it was both this sort of moment of sort of nationalism that came out of 9/11 in terms of genuinely people coming together, that also then led to some, real hard discussions about what that meant and how that should look in terms of being supportive, of being an American, of making sure that we were thinking of all Americans. And there's lots of examples, like you said, of Muslim Americans being either discriminated against, or the cases with a couple of Sikh community members who were thought to be Muslim, and there was violence, right? There were some examples of that came out that I think make the need to teach these things and to teach about stereotyping, especially of Muslims and Muslim Americans, I think really important, even maybe more important today because we're further from the events, but yet those stereotypes are still around.
You touched briefly on the creation of Department of Homeland Security and TSA. I had the privilege of meeting and interviewing a former CIA agent from 9/11, and she covered the Middle East region, which back then wasn't sexy. It was Russia, and the Cold War was still sexy. And she now teaches at Texas Christian University. The first thing she does when she teaches her class is to show the closed caption TV from Dulles Airport the morning of 9/11. Back then, you could just walk to the gate. You didn't have to get dropped off. There's nobody saying get a park here. There's no security screening. You would walk your loved one to the gate and say goodbye to them when they board the plane, and that was it. And now there's no shot of that, and kids just don't understand that that's how the world used to be.
You could walk through security with a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Right. The ironic thing is Boston Logan is one of the places where you couldn't do that. They actually did have more security. You couldn't go to the gate, and not anyone could go to the gate. That was one of the places that actually you couldn't do that. And I don't know the reasons why, but I just know as a kid going in and out of there with relatives that was one of the places that actually had more security. And so, it didn't mean the screening level was probably the way it is today, but they did have limited access in terms of going to the gate. But yeah, so much has changed in terms of travel and how people operate. And, the little baggie with the liquids and gels, right? That came in later. That didn't come in right after 9/11. That wasn't until after, I think, either the shoe bomber or the underwear bomber, right? Yep. The taking off of the shoes, like those things were things that came later as sort of airport security was strained in different ways and tested. But yeah, it's all become so normalized now that I think we don't think twice about it in terms of what that is. And I think some of the things that you are still coming up today that also came out of the war on terror, the use of drones, the use of, ongoing recording over cities, right? These were some of the strategies that were used in Iraq to try to track folks who were planting IEDs. And it's been questioned as whether that should be used for, if it's tracking protests in the US or if it's for crime, right? And I think those are real debates that we still have to think seriously about and have hard discussions about, along with some of the surveillance provisions that are still there that allow for, wiretapping into the electronic communications of Americans, and I think those are things that right now I think are important debates that we're probably not having as much as we should because we're distracted by a lot of other things.
Sure. I often ask adults what the phrase never forget means to them. What does never forget mean for students who never experienced 9/11?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do wonder when teachers come into classrooms, and I haven't had the ability to study closely young people's experiences. We've mainly talked in our studies that Diana Hess and I have done. We've looked at curriculum. We've looked at textbooks. We've looked at what teachers report teaching. We've looked at all these different materials, and we haven't had the chance to work with students. And it would be really curious for me other than anecdotally, what young people come away from when an event like that at the beginning of the school year, as you said, they're still getting to know their classmates' names. Like those things are still being established. And then all of a sudden, it's this day in history. They've probably vaguely heard of it some. They've seen it maybe a little bit on TV, although it's less and less, covered in the media now too. And then all of a sudden they're watching video of planes crashing into these buildings that no longer exist. And all of the chaos and things that went with it that's captured in those videos and how people reacted. And teachers are talking about their experiences and bring up something like never forget. And I wonder, the question I would have is what aspects are we really remembering when we say never forget? Like, what are the things that we're holding together? What are the things that is driving people to do? And I think that's probably, back to what you opened with, it probably depends a little bit in how it impacted your life and what your experiences were after that day, right? For those folks, I know I interviewed once as part of this study, a teacher from New York. I actually was from Connecticut. His daughter was born on 9/11. And so they were in a hospital just outside of the city. And they were there when all the triage units were being set up because they were expecting mass casualties to come into the hospital, and then no one came. And so for him and his daughter, they spent every year, and I can't remember the name of the organization in New York, you probably do, but it's sort of this 9/11 day of service.
Mm-hmm.
So every year he and his daughter would participate in that. And when we timed this study was when his daughter was a senior, when she was 18. And so he was, talking about his experience on that day because it was radically different from a lot of people's, but also what it had meant with him and his daughter, and now his daughter going on to college. It was going to be, their experience on that day would even change a little bit more because his daughter would be somewhere else. So, that's a very powerful meaning, along with folks who lost people on that day. And then I knew lots of people who were in the military afterward, and that impacted their lives greatly. And then we know, currently we know that, with the invasion of Iraq, and especially the evidence that was used for it, and the after effect of people feeling like they were, sort of tricked into believing particular aspects of it, that's one of those key markers as to why people have less of a faith in democratic institutions right now and the government. That along with after 9/11 was the first sort of Web 2.0, when we started having, the online sites like InfoWars and those coming out, which is where some of the conspiracy theories started, right? So in many ways, 9/11 was a starting point for some of those conspiracy theories. So it would be curious to know when we talk about, never forgetting, I would want to know sort of what were people takeaways in terms of how it informed their action going forward. And I think it's such a wide range depending on how you were impacted by it. And I think everyone was to some degree. If you were in the US and you were, in the news at all and weren't completely off the grid, you knew what was going on to some degree. But it would have been really interesting to know. And maybe there was a survey back in the day to go back and look and say, what kind of action was this going to inspire in people? What did it get them to think about or consider in their lives? One of the really interesting things we originally started this study. I went back to grad school in the fall of 2022 or 2002, sorry. And Diana Hess was my grad advisor, and she had started a study because all these groups came out with curriculum for teaching about the first anniversary, including Justice Scalia was part of one. All these different nonprofit groups and sort of civic education groups came out with curriculum for teaching about the first anniversary. And one of the things that we noticed right away was they tied the event into whatever sort of their goal was as an organization. So, for example, there's a group called the Close-Up Foundation, which does a lot around voting. 9/11 was used as something to inspire people to vote. Some of the groups focused on constitutional issues. 9/11 was used as an event to start to look at what were going to be the sort of constitutional issues that were going to come out of it. So one of the things we found was 9/11 was, because the event was so complicated and touched on so many things, it was also something that could be used to sort of get people to think about a whole wide range of issues. and to engage them in different facets of it. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen sort of over time has always been true. Like, people use it, but the outcome, the result, like what it inspires them to do action in, is across a really wide range. And oftentimes, though, it was adopted by different groups sort of toward their organization's mission to be able to do that. And that's one of the things that to me has been always really fascinating and continued to sort of, it's unfortunately like the research project that seemingly will never end, because it's always something new sort of evolving in it, including, it not appearing in the classroom, I think a lot of the ways that we thought it would. One of the early quotes we had in one of their pieces was it was going to be like the Sputnik moment for social studies or civic education. And I think maybe there was a little bit of that, but then pretty quickly we had No Child Left Behind came in, and social studies was marginalized in elementary classrooms down to like 30 minutes a week. So I think it's never quite bore out, I think, the way people thought it might in terms of learning about history, engaging in civics, talking about current issues, because of some of the curricular structures and policies that were in place.
You mentioned a few times about how, people, depending on where you were geographically, were impacted. And I've said that for the most part, unless you're in the Northeast corridor, so sort of, Boston to DC, didn't really affect you. Nobody really cares. A colleague of mine lived in Las Vegas at the time, and he woke up and he's like, "Oh, that's terrible." And he went to work. Meanwhile, I'm, trying to figure out whose fighter jets are flying overhead because I can't see 6 feet in front of my face. And how do I get home to my apartment and hopefully my wife on the Upper East Side? And that gets just further and further lost in memory and lost in time. One stat I recently learned is that every congressional district except one in the United States was impacted by 9/11. So I think that's a pretty telling sign in terms of how many people were affected. I mean, it was the whole country.
Yeah.
You've talked to few different ideas in terms about how things have been taught or how maybe they could be taught. If you had carte blanche to design the ideal 9/11 curriculum, what would it include?
I've always been curious, and I think, where was it? In the state of Vermont, I think they actually tried this in the 90s at one point. I've always been curious of teaching history sort of starting in the present and working backwards. And there's been some folks who've tried to do this. And I think, to me, we're always in this tension in history education between sort of the academic discipline and what we want history to be used for functionally for sort of an everyday citizen, right? One of the reasons we want to learn history is so that we can try to make sense of what's going on today. And that, to me, is the most powerful, especially if it helps to inform sort of decision making of either, it's used a lot of not making mistakes of the past. We're not very good at that, actually, but at least maybe being informed of the mistakes that we're going to make, or being cognizant of that this could be the outcome because of what's happened in the past. So I think, to me, I would use it, like I said, as a starting point for probably teaching about inquiry, but also tying into, key events, both today as well as in terms of, the ramifications that have come to us today to help make sense of what's going on. But also to look back at themes in U.S. history. And I was lucky enough to teach in a middle school in Minnesota where we had a lot of control over what our classroom could look like. And we developed a thematic sort of history curriculum that wasn't as tied chronologically. And so it allowed us to look at sort of big themes across history, sort of across time. And what that allowed, I think, is for you to engage in the big questions that cross different eras and big concepts that cross sort of geography and time, imperialism, right? These are questions that sort of go across, and it allows then for us to, I think, make connections between things that aren't just chronological sort of memorization of facts, but being able to make generalizations across these sort of bigger events and look at them and how they might repeat historically over time, right? The same kinds of cycles in what we see. So I think, to me, I would use it as one of the starting points. If I was going to teach a history class, that's probably how I would approach it. I would use it as a way to start inquiry into both U.S. history, but also its ties into global history. And I don't think you can teach about 9/11 without both of those. And I don't think you can teach 9/11, and especially the decisions that were made after, without understanding the context in which it happened. And I think it's easy to look at it as a sort of isolated event that was horrific and then sparked these other responses. But I think it's a much more thoughtful way to do it, to look at it in terms of the connections that were going on at the time, the events that led up to it, but also the long history right now. I mean, I think one of the important things that if I was teaching world history, I'd be spending a lot of time on the period after World War I, when countries were drawn up on a map in the Middle East, and why that was done that way and for what purposes, and its long-term sort of ramifications. In the same way that I was just in Slovakia doing work with Fulbright, with teachers there around sort of democracy ed and technology, and learning about in how such a small country, their maps have been redrawn multiple times after World War I, after World War II. And even there, the linguistic differences from region to region in such a small country, and the historical differences, what that means when you're one, functioning as a nation state, but also culturally, both in its richness, but also the challenges that it imposes. And I think that's what we see a lot of in terms of the Middle East. When we did a project around the 20th anniversary that was funded by the Library of Congress to pull together a bunch of sources related to 9/11 to do these kinds of inquiries. And one of the images we found that we included, I think on the front screen even, is a picture from Iran where they were holding vigils that night for Americans. And that Iranians were more than happy to share intelligence, if helpful, with the US. Now, you have to look at it again in the context of these are their regional sort of rivals, that they were more than happy if someone else wanted to, attack them in some way or something. But it is a really a different way that we often historically think about some of these things, when you see that Iranians are holding vigils for Americans, on the night of 9/11, and how many other countries came together at that time as well, because it was New York City and it was the World Trade Center. These are global symbols of both capitalism and culture, and popular culture, right? Which was the thing that struck me most when I went to the World Trade Center the first time, the museum there, and it was as much about the buildings as it was about the people in the events, which I found really striking. But also over time, it's made sense in terms of how much a symbol that those towers were.
Why does teaching 9/11 correctly matter the future of civic education and democracy?
I think this is one of those events. We looked at it in comparison in textbooks. We tried to compare how 9/11 was represented with how Pearl Harbor was represented, because they're often drawn in comparison. And they're both radically different events in many ways, but they were both these very collective memory events of their time. I mean, the shocking thing to think about is, as you said, 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and World War II was over in, 3.5, 4 years, right? And how much longer some of these things went on. I think what we have to understand, or should really start to investigate in, is how do countries respond after events like this? And this is where we can look at the US, and what were their motivations behind it, and what are the long-term effects of it? And I think as a representative sort of republic and democracy, we should be holding our elected members of Congress, state legislatures, whatever it might be, to account. And we should be engaging in some of the deep questions that came out of decisions that came after events like 9/11. And I think, surveillance is one of the huge ones. One of these big questions around sort of how do we want to live together, I think gets swept up sometimes in a little bit of the nationalism. I've been, my stepfather was a career Air Force fighter pilot, and then worked in ROTC and was always active in sort of veterans causes. And I've had other family members who have been veterans. And I have to say it's heartbreaking to see what's come, the experiences of a lot of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. One, there's huge groups of them And sort of I knew the folks more from the Vietnam era who, there were all kinds of similar things. But there again, we said, never let that happen again to veterans who've served the country, learned from Vietnam. And yet we see such high rates of homelessness. We see high rates of mental health issues, probably really high rates of traumatic brain injuries and things that weren't necessarily as well known when they happened, that we know a lot more about now. And that, we promised these folks that went to sacrifice their lives that now we sort of aren't supporting, in the same way that, there's been lots of health issues from folks who were at ground zero and volunteered, and that, to some degree, Congress has attempted to, fund some of their healthcare in that, but that's been a long struggle for those folks too. So I think, studying these events, I think we don't even look at them as just a sort of flashbulb world history event, that these events have consequences, and that we should, as citizens, really engage with what are those consequences. And, in the day, what was debated, and today, how has it become normalized? And we have to think, well, we do have control over changing some of those things. If we cared about it, we could try to push to have folks elected or lobby our members of Congress to change the surveillance packages that they use. Whatever the issue is, we could push to have more veterans, benefits and things, or not have benefits cut. So I think if these are issues that we say that we care about, then we should, one, engage in them at a depth that we actually know something. You can't engage at a depth of everything and know everything about everything. So I think we have to pick and choose. And to me, I think more recent history in many ways, when we ground it in our knowledge of sort of the past, in terms of looking historically where it came from, I think is actually a much better model of an informed, engaged citizenship than being able to, name every member of the Constitutional Convention, right? So to me, I think it's a little bit of function. So I want to engage. I want to model for students, how should we think about history? How should we think about learning from the lessons of the past, engaging with evidence, engaging in these questions that are contested? There are no sort of clear right answers out of any of these things. So how can we engage in that muckiness and messiness of things? And how is that really modeling what we want citizens to be able to do? And again, doing it, like I said, modeling it in a way that that also meets what we would hope for in terms of civility of those conversations, and working on shared decision making, and not just shouting past each other.
You touched on a lot of great stuff there. I want to go back to the beginning of your response. You talked about the first responders, working at the pile at ground zero afterwards. We've lost more first responders to 9/11 related illnesses than were actually lost on 9/11. You talked about veterans and coming back from the global war on terror. 17 veterans commit suicide every day. 17 a day. They volunteered. We're all volunteer force. They volunteered to make the ultimate sacrifice. And to your point, they're not getting the benefits that they deserve. And so just, these are things that our students need to understand. When you see a first responder, when you see active duty military, you see somebody wearing a Vietnam veteran baseball hat, just go up and say thank you. Anytime I'm at my local coffee bakery shop, if there's somebody there, I'll buy them their coffee and their bagel in the morning. And so that little thank you means the world to them. And we just take it for granted. We think of them as, if they're a police officer, they're managing the construction down the street from us, or they're going to give us a speeding ticket on the highway. And so there's a lot more to it than that. One of my classmates in my doctorate program was deployed in Afghanistan. And halfway through our program, he was diagnosed with cancer from the burn pits in Afghanistan. So these are things that aren't really talked about. They're certainly not taught, but they're things that are real. They're about people that they're in your neighborhood, they're your friends, they're at your church, your temple, whatever it may be. And so just there's a second layer to this, I guess, what I'm trying to get at in terms of not just 9/11 at the surface, but there's a lot more that's underneath that. And the way you ended that response, I loved it. And I'll go back to the students in the classroom. If students leave the classroom with curiosity, empathy, and the ability to examine evidence thoughtfully, and even if they disagree politically, is that ultimately what successful civic education looks like?
I mean, I think, my goal as a teacher, and now someone who teaches teachers, but also, designs curriculum and tries things out. My goal is to equip students to be able to engage thoughtfully in issues that they care about, if it's in their local community, at the state level, wherever it might be. And thoughtfully meaning, is it grounded in evidence? Is it grounded with an understanding of as much as we can, the different perspectives or positions that people might be bringing to an issue, which is actually really good argumentation that we've lost. Like trying to understand why people believe what they believe, I think right now is like a art form that we all should be practicing. But that they're equipped to basically go out and engage on the issues that they care about, and that they're inspired to. And that I think one of the challenges right now, especially with things like climate change and these sort of really big issues, is they feel like they, as a one person, they can't do anything. And so we talk about this as being sort of this self-efficacy to even engage in an issue because they think it's hopeless, or like, what can one person do? And so that's why we focus a lot on what can we do locally? What's within our bandwidth to starting point to engage with, even making people aware of something. So I think our job as all teachers, I think this is a job of schools, is to develop people who can thoughtfully engage in serious, complex problems and work together to do it. We hear a lot about individualized education. What we know from learning theory is that people learn with each other through engaging with different people and engaging in complex problems and collaborating. And we know that, I mean, you can make your arguments now for an individual in ChatGPT going back and forth. But generally speaking, you're not going to be able to solve complex problems by yourself with, even with AI. AI itself is essentially a giant mess of collaboration, in good ways and bad, that it's people speaking to each other there. So I think that's definitely the role of schools and social studies teachers. I think one of the challenges, because of the current political context, teachers aren't feeling comfortable in engaging in some of the questions, maybe even that they would have 5 years ago. And it's not because of what they were doing was trying to indoctrinate students or trying to push a certain views on them. They're just worried about the perception of engaging in issues that, we talk about sort of small c controversial and big C controversial. If a controversial issue to me is something that's an open question in society and that reasonable people disagree on. I mean, I think reasonable people maybe is a stretch, maybe sometimes these days, but like those are things that we want to engage in class. There's other things that are controversial because someone might disagree about it or has strong feelings on it. And usually those are things that when we break it down, probably their views on it aren't that far apart. But we've been trained in society right now and through media to identify people who might identify with the political outgroup and automatically assume things about people. In the same way that we might automatically assume things about people, about Muslim Americans because of what we've seen in media, right? Because what we've seen on different sites. And so I think it's those assumptions that get challenging, but which is also the role of schools. I think we should challenge assumptions, challenge stereotypes, and again, expose them to things that they might not get exposed to otherwise, in terms of questions that they ask, in terms of perspectives, in terms of things that are important in the US, and it might not be in your state, but it might be other parts of the US where there is a large Muslim population, or like in Minnesota, where I first started teaching, was when we had Somali newcomers. So a third of my classes were Somali kids coming out of refugee camps in Kenya, and they weren't literate in their own language, let alone in English. And so, I think it's our job to try to figure out how to engage them in what we want to see in terms of the citizens that we want everyone to be, and participate in that way. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit.
No, that's okay. I'm glad to hear that you're educating the educators, because we need more people with your thought process out there. So I appreciate that. Jeremy Stoddard, University of Wisconsin at Madison, professor and researcher. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for bringing this attention and keeping it going in terms of the questions of 9/11, especially going into the 25th anniversary.
No, it's my honor. I'm Chris Meek. We're out of time. We'll see you same time, same place. Until then,